Welcome to the True Story London podcast. I'm Michelle Toth. In this podcast, we listen to a true personal story told live at one of our shows in London, followed by a conversation with the storyteller about their background, process, story themes, and more. Today's storyteller is Ryan Sheehan, sharing a story of pregnancy loss from a father's perspective. It's an emotional, courageous, and important point of view on an often under-discussed topic, and we're so grateful to Ryan for sharing it with us. Afterward, we talk about just how much has changed in Ryan's life since both the events of the story and the telling of it. But first, let's listen to Ryan's story, recorded live at 21 Soho.
In January of 2020, my wife and I found out that she was pregnant for the third time. First two times had not worked out for us, had miscarriages both times. The first time we got overexcited and we let people know before the 12-week mark. And then we had to deal with all the awkward conversations of reeling that information back in. The second time we waited until we lost the baby. And then we told people that we had lost a baby, and we were upset that they didn't give a shit, you know? Like, they didn't get to experience it with us, you know? And I think that's a little bit about the paradox of how and why we don't talk about miscarriage. As a result of that, for our third pregnancy, and the fact that we're a little bit older couple, we were deemed geriatric, which was a flagrant and unprompted attack by the hospital. So we kept that a secret until our 12-week appointment. We went in, got to see a little baby, got to see a normal nuchal fold. The nuchal fold test is to kind of let you know some early signs of Down syndrome and a couple other abnormalities that could happen. So we got a normal diagnosis from that, and it was time to celebrate. That was in about the end of February, and we were standing in the airport ready to go to Morocco for a little vacation. And we got a call from the hospital that we had been red flagged. Although things were normal because we were geriatrics, they wanted to do some more testing. They wanted to do an amniocentesis, which is where they take like a giant hollow sword and stuff it through your wife's stomach and into the uterus and suck out some of the baby's juices that he's swimming in, and test the DNA just to double check. And we were beside ourselves with geriatric rage. But we did some like quick Googling from the airport, and we found this thing called a harmony test, which is much less invasive. It comes from the blood. The results come back quicker. That was available at 14 weeks, which meant that we could get the test results back at the same time, have that less invasive test, and still enjoy our vacation, which we did. So we boarded the plane. We went to Morocco. We didn't think about it one more time through that whole time, except going through every possible eventuality that could befall our tiny little baby that was yet to be born. But we got back in mid-March to a very different London. While we were gone, someone had eaten a dodgy bat somewhere, and people were shitting themselves everywhere, if you remember, which was ironic because there wasn't a roll of loo roll to be found in the entire town. So we found a private doctor that did the harmony test. We went in, they did that for us. We held each other tightly in our locked down little house, and we got the results back, and they told us with 99% accuracy that our baby was fine. And so great news again. And we were in the clear until our 20-week appointment. A lot had changed in London, as I just mentioned. One of those things that changed was that only the woman could go in for the appointments. The dads had to stay outside. So the 20-week appointment came around. We walked our dogs up to Chelsea and Westminster Hospital. My wife went in. I started to walk the dogs around the block, and I got a text from her about 5 minutes or so later, "Come back." And I was like, fuck, man. I knew this was coming. You know, what's happened now? I get back and she's just standing in front of the hospital. I said, what happened? She said, what do you mean what happened? Everything's fine. We had the appointment. Everything's good, man. You know, baby's a little short, that's all. But let's get home. So we walked back through the streets of peak pandemic London on our own with our dogs back to our safe little hole. And we were the happiest couple of people for the next 8 or 9 weeks in post-apocalyptic London. Our 28th week appointment happened actually on the 29th week because of the overload to the NHS. But by that point, they were letting dads in the room. You could see the fatigue on the people. We were the last appointment of the day. We had a technician who had lost her good cheer for the day. And well, we joked about our short little baby. She poked and prodded my wife like she was a piece of meat. And she said, I'm just going to run and talk to one of my colleagues real quick, if you don't mind. Run through some of these measurements. And so we sat in the room, and she came back a few minutes later. She said, all the doctors are gone. Do you mind if I have somebody call you in the morning? We said, yeah, that's sure. Sure, that sounds fine. So we got a call in the morning to come back in for another scan. And we came back in. It was a different lady, a little bit better bedside manner. She said, yeah, some kids have short legs, it'll catch up or it'll be short. And she did the scan, and she looked, and she said, I'm just going to grab one of my colleagues real quick, have a look at some of these measurements. And that colleague came in, had a look, and she said, I'm just gonna grab one of my colleagues real quick and have a look at that. And that went on until there were no colleagues left to grab. And we were talking to the pediatric cardiologist about several heart defects in our child, which was bad news. But it turns out that was the good news, because the baby could have survived that with a few open heart surgeries. But that was coupled with the short limbs, which was a sign of some rare and quite scary issues that could come up with some kids. So they said, we really need some more information. So we went for that amnio. Then they pulled out that big sword. And before they did, we said, can we just maybe find out the sex first? Just so we know, just so we're dealing with a person here. And so we found out that it was a girl, and they took the amnio and sent us away. And we went through a whirlwind the next 4 weeks of learning new terms and initialisms as we thought about the future for our daughter, who we decided to name Galia, after my wife's father's mother. The first thing that we learned was a term called mosaic trisomy 22. Subterms of that, like asymmetrical body symmetry, renal malformation, postnatal growth failure, and incompatible with life. Shortly after that, we learned a new initialism, TFMR, which stands for termination for medical reasons. This was at about 33 weeks, and it was the first time that me or my wife, much less us as a couple, had been faced with a decision that had no right answers. So we had to come to a conclusion. We had to decide on the least wrong answer, and we had to agree on that answer and live with that for the rest of our lives, and we had to do it pretty quick. In the end, we decided to go for the TFMR. They brought us into the hospital a few days later, and another needle came out, that one with potassium chloride, and they stopped our baby's heart. And 3 days later, we went back, because in those 4 weeks, I had never really realized that just because the heart stopped doesn't mean it's not a baby. We went back in for the delivery, and we were there for 3 days, and not much was happening until the last round of drugs. And then it all happened at once. And for 40 minutes, I watched my wife shed her skin and take on a supernatural form and deliver our daughter. And in that moment, I thought that maybe I would go deaf from the silence in the room of a newborn baby not crying. But we held each other after that in the room, and we told each other that we made the right decision. And we believed that, and I believe that, and I believe that to this day. And we left stronger as a result of it. But I also had an individual experience in there as well, where the medical staff was attending to my wife, and I sat on the floor crying, and our daughter sat on the floor in a basket on her own. And I just experienced that solitude. And every time I shut my eyes, I experienced that solitude. I didn't think that it would ever go away, or that I would ever be able to talk about it or explain it to anyone. And I didn't know what I was going to do. And then we got home from the hospital, and my wife's brother and his wife were there, and with our dogs and a smile and a hug and a bottle of whiskey. And as I drank that whiskey, I realized that I wasn't seeing that image anymore. And then started a new chapter in my life where I just sought that annihilation over and over. And in that process, people would always ask me how I was doing. And I would say I was doing fine, and they would say, you got to get that grief out, or the other shoe's going to drop one day. And I'd say, yeah. But I was afraid of it. And the drinking kept that away. So I continued drinking. I mean, I worked, I was functional. If you ever had a problem with alcohol before, that's something you tell yourself. At least I'm showing up to work every day. And that continued, and I didn't realize that I was driving a wedge between my wife and I until my 40th birthday, or the aftermath thereof, where my wife woke up and saw the aftermath of beer cans and cocaine residue. In that moment of clarity, I saw what had happened, I saw that my wife had been hurting and I wasn't there to support her, and that I had lost a baby and she had lost a baby and a husband at the same time, and was having to carry herself through that. So that day, I stopped drinking, and that was really scary. I didn't know what was going to happen with the grief. I kept waiting for the other shoe to drop. And I realized today, as a matter of fact, in therapy, that part of what I was holding on to was other people's expectations of how I should grieve. If I sobered up and fell apart, that would be okay. But what happened is that I sobered up and I realized that I'm all right, I'm just sad. And I was worried about how people would process that sadness while I processed my grief. There's something about processing grief. There's something about the word processing that means to me that it's over, and I don't want it to be over, That's the bond between me and my daughter. So I'm okay with being sad. Thank you.
Ryan, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
It's really nice to see you again.
It's good to see you as well.
So listening back to that story after a couple of years, we both just listened to it together. It's very emotional. How do you feel hearing it for the first time in a while?
Well, yeah, I'd forgotten a lot of it. It's a real roller coaster. I can't remember if I intentionally told the story in a way where it felt like something bad was going to happen, and then it didn't so many times. I mean, even though I lived it, I was like, it's like quite a journey. And then it's terrible. Yeah. Yes. And then it's terrible. And, so much has changed in my life, and then so much is still the same, I guess.
Absolutely. And this was February of 2022. Do you want to update us on life?
Okay. So around that point, we had already begun the process of IVF. And at some point in IVF, when the embryo reaches blastosis and starts to double, they give you the option to do something called PGT, which is pre-genetic testing. So they did the pre-genetic testing, everything was fine. What we didn't know is that in 10% of the cases where they do pre-genetic testing, they sort of slice 8 cells off and examine those. 90% of the time it heals back, 10% of the time it cleaves and becomes twins. So we found out at 12 weeks that we were having twins.
Whoa.
In December 20th of 2022, we had identical twin girls. Yeah, they're doing great. Super fun and difficult and rewarding and all that stuff. And yeah, life is very, very different than it was.
I can only imagine.
Yeah.
So, Ryan, was the process of telling the story, was it healing for you? Do you remember? Because I remember being in the workshop that we did prior to this. I think you were working with Dahlia, and Dahlia is a true storyteller. In fact, she's the first story on the first ever True Story podcast. And I remember you saying, I know what I want to tell. I know what I want to talk about. I want to talk about the father's perspective on pregnancy loss.
Yeah, what I remember from that is, because, I had a dalliance with stand-up comedy. And so I wasn't too worried about being on stage. Thought about telling a funny story, but working with Dahlia, she had told a story about trying to get pregnant. So the idea was sort of born from that. Yeah, I didn't realize how serious of a story it would end up being.
Right.
I guess at the time.
I'm wondering what your experience of your own humor has been. Have you always been funny?
I was a younger sibling.
Of how many?
Of two.
Of two.
And the older brother was a very good kid, and he did what he was told. And I didn't really do that. I was a little bit more of a free spirit, And so I think that I would often use humor with my parents and my family to diffuse tension that probably I caused in the first place. But I think at a very young age, I realized that sort of being funny could elicit a positive attention that felt nice. And I also think that I'm very avoidant of feeling emotions with negative connotation. I don't like to get angry. I don't like to be sad. I don't like to be frustrated. And so I often try to diffuse tension through laughter.
So do you think that your brother playing the good kid role in your family gave you freedom to be a little bit more edgy or a little bit more disruptive?
I think so. I mean, I think now having kids, there's not really an older and a younger with twins, but just having kids and being interested in other people who have kids, I really see now the plight of the older sibling who was always there and then kind of lost the limelight a bit. And I think it's instilled in older siblings when there's a new baby, that you have to be quiet at these times. You have to help mom and dad because things are harder and all these things. And so they become this third quasi-parent person who feels more responsibility than the younger sibling does. And so I do think, looking back, that in my particular circumstance, I don't think my brother ever had the chance to be freewheeling. People always say, with the first kid, you're looking at the books and looking things up on the internet and all that stuff. And then the second kid, you're he'll fall, he'll learn, that sort of thing. And so I think that I experienced immediate consequences to my own actions. And being a freewheeling and risky person, I'd just, if I fell on my face or whatever it was, I'd kind of be oh, that's fair. That's what you get sometimes.
So this idea of not wanting to feel anger or frustration or sadness, do you think that's just how you were wired, or was that something you learned in your family growing up?
I think my family is not a group of deep feelers. They're very Southern, very stoic, I guess. The emotions they feel are tired, hungry, a little chilly, So I don't really remember, not to take a knock at my parents, but I just don't remember being oh, I'm feeling ashamed.
Yeah.
I remember, in fact, my wife early on in our relationship asking me if I often felt anxiety. And I was I don't think I ever feel anxiety. And she said, you know how you feel in airports? And I said, yeah. And she was do you ever feel like that outside of airports? And I was oh yeah, I feel like that all the time. I was I feel a low grade version of that all the time. And she was that's anxiety.
It's so good to have women in your life.
Yeah. And
to tell you how you feel.
Yeah. Well, in that case, life is miserable.
How did she know to ask you that? Do you have any idea?
I think I don't act like a normal person in airports. I didn't, I grew up in the South of America. You can drive to most places. We were a sporty family, so we drove to tournaments within the Southeast. But I never flew. And I'm also very forgetful. And so feeling you show your passport or whatever, and you get past a certain point where if you forgot whatever, all your underwear or your wallet or your keys or your phone, they're you can't go back through that door. That is a one-way door. and you're here now. Really freaks me out. And the fact that you go into, like with Border Patrol, you go into a room where you also can't go backward, but they're controlling how quickly you can go forward as well. And that just made me feel really like locked in and claustrophobic. And so then I would be like a really ornery old man, and I'd be like, what is going on here? Who's in charge? You know?
Loss of control was not your jam.
No. And my wife would just be like, just chill out. Everyone's in the same line, you know? And I would just be irate, and I'd be like, no, my shoe's untied. Who's going to fix that? Maybe I was doing some things in the rest of my life that were a little unhinged, and she was
resembled
like,
that.
And she was like, you know how you are in airports? Because I think that was just like a very intensely concentrated version of anxiety.
Interesting when you think about like the origins of how we process emotion and like how accessible they are and how much we can manage them when they show up in bigger ways, like in your story.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
I think what I grapple with, given that I'm always like meeting people and interested in their stories and want to, if it makes sense, persuade them to share it in a public setting.
Right.
It's not necessary for everyone to tell their story in a public setting. Like sometimes it's okay just to do it with friends or at the pub. But then I hear someone like you where when you share your experience, I feel like you have genuine insight, like you're offering up personal take on grief or sadness or the desire to like block out feelings, but why? You know, and the way that you in the story were talking about how you chose to use alcohol and why.
Do you know what I remember about that night is that, so this is the difference to me between a true story evening and a comedy evening, is that in a comedy evening, there's laughter in the room, and you just have to give permission for people to let it out. In a true story evening, there is interest in the room, and it's very different. And, you know, I can remember saying certain things that in a conversation you might say to someone, and when you're looking in their eyes, you get a little acknowledgement of levity from that person, so that you can continue to go on telling a harder story in like a self-deprecating way. But when you say that to a room of people and they're not interested in letting you or themselves off the hook of like what is impending, it's like a vacuum in the room that just sucks courage out of a person. I don't remember exactly what I said, but there was something that like in a one-on-one setting, someone would give me permission to carry on and like keep on a brave face. And it was not available in that room. And I was like, I'm going to start crying, and there's a long way to go to the end of the story, you know?
Do you think you in any way felt compelled to share more than you wanted to share?
I don't think so. I didn't really know what I wanted to convey necessarily. I had a loose framework written on a piece of paper so that I didn't lose my place. And then I was just like, that's enough. And then just now when I was listening back to it, the way it ended, I was like, oh, that is gutting to hear. I'm glad I didn't continue trying to like over-explain that point, because it really made me cry again.
There are a couple points there at the end. And one that really sat with me was this idea of feeling grief and being okay with the sadness, like wanting to feel sad. Yeah.
I think on that particular point, I had not thought about that until I said it. And I think that's why I kind of like wavered at the end as well and was like, let's leave it there, you know, because that did feel like a really heavy moment of identification of something happening in me that, you know, maybe has happened throughout my whole life. Because it is okay to just feel sad or feel however you're feeling at the time. And I think that we forget that when we're busy. Like, I want the people that I work with to be happy at work so that I don't have to look at them and see that they're sad. You know, I want people to be cheerful. And when they're not, I'm like, hey, what's going on? What's wrong with you? What's happening in your life? Oftentimes, inquiring about a person's feelings for me is more about, how do you feel about me right now? You seem not yourself. Am I the cause of that?
Oh, that's interesting. So it's a self-oriented realization or empathy as opposed to necessarily caring about what's going on with the other person.
Yeah.
But how are you reflected back from that
Because
person?
I feel like I see that in other people as well when they're like, oh, what's going on with you? And they're quite cagey about asking the question. And then you're like, oh, I just got a parking ticket or whatever. And they're like, oh, okay. And then you can sort yourself out.
Yeah.
I don't want to talk to you about the parking ticket as long as it wasn't me that
I didn't do
caused
anything.
the situation.
Yeah.
And so I think that was part of my process of grief was that, the death of my child wasn't getting a parking ticket. Mm-hmm. And it wasn't about anyone else. And it was just, I felt the way I felt. And it was just like sad and insecure and vulnerable and all these different things. And there's trust or the lack thereof involved in what you really want to say to people. It's not the setting all the time, and you don't have the relationship all the time for someone to be like, oh, you look a little forlorn, what's going on? And then you launch into that true story of TFMR and trisomy, whatever, And so I think that's what I realized was that it was like, I'm just sad, and that's what I want to be right now.
I have to say I can relate to this so much right now because I've lost my mom a couple of months ago, and I'm just grieving. I am sad. Everything's muted, and that's okay. It feels appropriate.
Yeah.
And sometimes I'm the biggest extrovert, but sometimes I just want to be alone because I don't want to worry about how other people are going to react to my sadness. I don't want to be responsible for their reaction to my sadness or their natural desire to shut it down and tell me it's normal, it'll be fine. Want a drink? I don't blame them for not wanting to necessarily feel my sadness on a Sunday afternoon at the pub. Yeah. I get it, but that's what makes me want to maybe not engage.
Yeah.
And maybe want to just be left to grieve or left to be sad. And that's how I feel in this moment of clarity with grief and sadness. But it's also relevant for everyday sadness or everyday frustration that someone might or might not need the attention on it or the need to resolve it.
Yeah, I feel like grief and just crippling sadness is like a breach of the social contract.
So you have to keep yourself away.
Yeah. And there are certain things where you don't care about the social contract anymore, where you're like, I'm hurting so much that I don't care that this makes you uncomfortable. And the part of me that is a people pleaser and that wants to just get along in society is not available to you right now. So I'd rather just not be around you because I can't also hold your insecurities at this time. Mm-hmm. Like everything that I'm doing is focused on this, whether it's experiencing this or getting over this or relishing this, whatever it is. And I don't have any spare energy for social niceties. When something like that happens, you also get from the people who love you most. Read Mitch Albom, 5 People You Meet in Heaven, or like, there's this book called Grief is the Thing with Feathers. And it's great, and like you go online and you search quotes about grief or whatever, and they're all very poignant and profound and deep, but they're horseshit at the time because your ego is in there. Who you are is in there. And you're like, this happened to me. Mm. This will be true in a month, and it was true a month ago, but right now, this is nothing to me. I'm experiencing something very visceral and elemental or something.
And this in your story came after you spent a bunch of time like trying to avoid or distract from the grief, at least in the telling.
Yeah.
Like where you were using alcohol as a way of just protecting yourself perhaps from feeling some of that pain.
Yeah. I think of alcohol as like, the Pink Floyd album cover with the prism.
Oh, I sure do.
Alcohol is the prism, right? And the rainbow side was all the emotions that I could feel in a day, from a good day or a bad day. And the prism was the celebration of alcohol. And then I always knew the outcome was the straight white line on the other side,
Of kind of nothingness.
Everything could make me drink. And no matter how high or how low I felt before I drank, I would come out even on the other side. So I definitely drank to avoid the feelings of grief, but I drank to celebrate. I drank because I'd worked really hard that day or because I hadn't worked really hard that day or whatever it was,
Yeah.
Everything I did was about avoidance at the time. I was not running towards any feelings that I was having.
Yeah. Well, I think it's interesting that you're describing this time when you were young, when you were really young, and just learning to avoid feelings. And now this time when you're an adult where you've done both. You've like spent a bunch of time avoiding, and now it sounds like you're in this phase of actually feeling those feelings.
I mean, I still am who I am. I'm still very avoidant of things that make me uncomfortable. But I understand now that like the cavalry isn't coming, you know? It's up to you to sort your life out and to like look after the beings around you that are helpless, you know, and help them like form their own code of ethics that they're going to go out into the world having. I'm still the same person that avoids. I just do it anyway now.
Meaning feel the feelings.
Yeah, I feel the feelings and I do the thing. You know, like I go to therapy now. I mean, I've gone to therapy just about every Monday for like 6 years. It's a 10-minute walk from my house. And every Monday I walk there and think, I might just stop at the coffee shop and say that. Every Monday. I'm like, I don't want to do this. And most Mondays I leave and I'm like, I'm glad I did that. But my memory doesn't last 7 full days to come back to a Monday and be like, all right, let's go talk about all the things that made me feel bad this week and the rest of my life, you know?
So I just wanted to just talk a little bit about the process and the impact of telling the story, because I remember we met the workshop where you came up with this idea to share this particular story. Mm-hmm. And then I remember you generated a draft of this story that I would say was pretty close to final really fast. Like it seemed to just like pour out of you with like a language and flow that I was really struck by, because it's years ago now and I'm still remembering being struck by it.
Yeah, I remember writing it down. I remember kind of mulling it over in my mind. When I did stand up, I didn't write it down, and I would try to do something new each time. I felt like that's how I worked best creatively, to get a sense of being genuine and authentic across, because I feel like I'm a terrible actor. And so if I know what I'm going to say, then I start like analyzing the inflections and stuff. And the next thing you know, I sound like an absolute Martian when I'm speaking, you know? And so I remember being really not into writing it down. And everything we've talked about, I think, lends itself to the fact that I grew up as a very sort of like practical, like these are the facts type of person. And so I was like, just write down the facts and then think about how you felt at the time. You know, that was sort of the process. And I mean, I even heard it when I was listening back to the story about how callous and cavalier certain things in the story I was talking about feel. We were faced with this decision of TFMR, and we said, can we at least find out the sex? Like, I never addressed the fact that there was a lot of feelings wrapped up in like not deciding to know the sex. And when you're the parent, like that world of possibility of, is it a boy? Is it a girl? Is he going to grow up and play sports? Is she going to grow up and play sports? Are they going to be a politician? Whatever it is. But there is a fantasy involved in that. And then we made the decision to make it real. This is a person. These are the names we thought about if it was this person. These are the ways we've talked about parenting this person in all these eventualities, you know? And then in the story, I just say, and so, you know, we decided we'd find out the sex, and it was a girl. And then I just move on to the next thing. Like I didn't care that it was a girl, you know?
I don't know if it makes you feel better, but as a listener, I didn't hear it that way.
Really?
I don't think you have to say everything that is true for people to get that there's more.
Yeah. I
really felt like there was compassion throughout this story. I didn't think you came across as unfeeling at all.
Oh, good. Thank you. I think that the conversations that my wife and I had about how to parent and the hopes and dreams that we had for our first child, they're very intellectual because there's no practical there. So you speak theoretically about things, and then in practice, when there are human beings, the list of priorities is completely different. You know, then it becomes more about what are we going to do when they get to the age that we have to tell them no? Because all you want to do is say yes to a little kid who is so cute and can't help themselves. Yeah. You know, obviously you want the best for your kids, but it's not about like, how are we going to make sure that this child achieves its full potential? It's a much more nurturing set of conversations that we now have. And it's much more reflective of how I was parented and how my wife was parented, and like certain views that I now have about my own parents that occupy that space.
Are you more understanding?
Yeah, I think I am. Because it's, you reach a point with your parents where there's so much baggage tied up in your relationship, even if it's a good relationship. Doing talk therapy, you look back a lot. Why do you think that is? What happened in your childhood to make this happen? And if you're not careful, you can be like, my parents were terrible parents and they should have never had me, and that's not the case. Like, everyone is trying to provide the best that they can. When I edit my life and look back on decisions that my parents did or didn't make, they didn't have the internet, first of all, to look things up. And there's a lot of split-second decisions that happen. And you have the benefit of hindsight because you know how it turned out. You don't know how the other decision would have turned out, Because I think about it sometimes because, like, my kids fake cry for attention. And I think all kids fake cry for attention. But then you see parents of 15-year-olds who know that their kid is doing an evolved version of fake crying for attention. And when you see that from the outside of the context, you're like, this is a very callous human being who doesn't care about their kid. And they're like, I know she thinks she means it right now. She 100% believes that the world is ending. But the world has ended for her 500 times before as well, So, yeah, when I think back to formative things that have happened in my life that I think make me who I am, and my parents' involvement in that, they weren't looking at those times as pivotal moments. They were just doing the best they could.
Yeah, making a call in that moment.
Yeah, exactly.
And so you're doing that, I guess, every day times 2.
Yeah, exactly right.
So just a quick thing on the new business.
Yes.
It would be great to hear what it is and how it's going.
Yeah, so in a twist of fate, ironically, I still don't drink, but I run a bar. So it's a chef's table style restaurant on the ground floor and then a basement bar. So Low Country is the bar, which is named after where I'm from. The Low Country, is all sea level there on the coast of Georgia.
So it's Low Country, and it's in Shoreditch.
It is indeed, Nile Street.
I think that's an interesting idea, to be the person creating and crafting these drinks and not yourself participating in the drinking of them.
Yeah. I wouldn't recommend it to everyone to take that path. And I'm not precious about not drinking. I think it's about being true to the spirit of the law rather than the letter of the law, so to speak. And I know the difference between tasting a drink and having a drink.
Sure.
But even still, it's a very dangerous thing to do when you've got a past and a complicated relationship with alcohol. I think of it as like solving a problem. I think of the culinary aspect and the chemical aspect of it. It's like working with something that you have an allergy to, and you just take extra precautions with that.
So, Ryan, you are a father of young twins, a husband. You have this exciting entrepreneurial venture, running a bar, helping to run a restaurant. You're a very busy person.
Yes.
But you're also a really gifted storyteller. Do you think you will do more with writing and performing at any point?
It's a good question. I think about it a lot. I never thought of myself as a creative person, but then I think back on the things that I've done in my life, and there have been some creative endeavors. And, creating these cocktails out of thin air or making riffs on old cocktails and things like that. It's a creative endeavor, and it scratches the itch for creativity that I feel. That and those sort of one-on-one engagements with people at the bar. But I think if that wanes, or if I'm not at the bar 60 hours a week, then I will start to feel a buildup of energy that needs to be like
released,
dispelled somehow, and we'll pursue some sort of storytelling or comedy or something like that.
Well,
again.
If that happens and you feel compelled to tell more stories, I hope you will let us know, because we would love to hear more from you.
Absolutely. Yeah.
It's been really fun chatting and hearing your perspective on these like big, heavy topics, but also the lighter ones too.
Yeah,
so,
thank you for having me. It's great to
so
see
much.
both of you.
Yeah, you too. Thanks, Ryan.
Thanks.
Thanks for listening. For more information about today's storyteller and conversation, check out the show notes. The True Story London podcast is hosted by me, Michelle Toth. Our producer is Ellis Ballard. Our theme music is by Sea Noise. Live recordings were provided by Laughing Around and recorded at 21 Soho. More information about our live shows and workshops can be found at truestorylondon.com. And just one more thing. If you haven't already, please subscribe or follow and rate us on your favorite podcast platform. It really does help us to reach more people. Thanks, and we'll see you for another episode soon.